Hey, welcome to the show, everybody. My name is Mike. I am your host here of the Leadership Toolkit. If you're new to this show, first off, thank you very much for taking the time to join us. We know your time is valuable. We want to offer you something that is tangible and actionable. And I bring people on from various verticals of business to have collaborative conversations and talks about what's worked for them, what hasn't worked for them, right? What are the wins? What are the losses? What can you learn from it? And I have an absolutely phenomenal guest on the show today. I'm very excited to introduce to all of you, Mr. Jacob Morgan, who is, he's a 5-time best-selling author. He's got a new book coming out titled Leading with Vulnerability, as you see here on the screen. So welcome to the show, Jacob.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. I'm very appreciative. I'm really honored and humbled to be able to have a conversation just with your background. It totally aligns with what I enjoy talking about and getting into leadership. And so we'll talk a lot about that and a lot about the book coming out. And if you would do me a favor, just take maybe a couple minutes and give us the rundown, a little bit of what is your background? What did you do to get to where you are, and where are you at now? And then maybe a little bit about the book.
Sure. So I've been doing what I'm doing for around 15 years now. I started off in the corporate world and became very disengaged and disenfranchised with what it was like to work for other people. So after having a bunch of terrible jobs working for other people, I decided to go off on my own. Like I said, that was around 15 or 16 years ago. And ever since then, I've been really fascinated with this idea of creating great leaders, engaged employees, and future-ready organizations. So fast forward to today, I've written, what will be my 5th book. So 5 books over the past few years. Creating a lot of content, speaking at a lot of events, fortunate enough to be working with a lot of great CEOs and leaders around the world. And that's pretty much where I spend a lot of my time, is focusing on those 3 themes of leadership, employee experience, and the future of work.
Absolutely phenomenal. And I've got it here on the screen for those of you, if you're just tuning in, you can get Jacob's new book at leadwithvulnerability.com. I've got that spelled right? Better double check it again. But yeah, I was so pleased. I was so excited when you reached out and to have this conversation. Just like your background, you've interviewed some unbelievable folks and have endorsements from Mastercard and Best Buy and Audi and the Home Depot, Hyatt, right? So like who better to talk about leadership and than someone that's had interviews and endorsements with all of those folks. And I think that's absolutely phenomenal. So when you're talking about, and with this new book, Leading with Vulnerability, and the full title is Leading with Vulnerability, Unlock Your Greatest Superpower to Transform Yourself, Your Team, and Your Organization. You stated in there that in your prior book, which was The Future Leader, that vulnerability came up quite a bit. Yeah. And one of the things I was impressed with, we talked just briefly beforehand, that you've had the opportunity to either work with or interview roughly 2,000 CEOs and business leaders. And so can you expand a little bit on how that's been impactful and how did that lead you to writing this new book?
Yeah, 2,000 people over the years, right? I mean, even in my previous book, it was 140. The new book was 100. And then just doing tons of events over the years. It's been very interesting because you learn a lot directly from leaders. It's one thing to read a leadership book. It's another thing to actually have a CEO at an organization tell you their challenges and their struggles and their strategies directly. So it's been very, very fascinating for me to learn from and work with some of these fantastic leaders over the years, and to be able to spot trends that keep coming up, ideas that keep coming up. And that's really what the basis and the foundation is for a lot of my content. And that's where this idea of this new book, Leading with Vulnerability, came from. Because as I would talk to and interview a lot of CEOs, I would keep hearing from these business leaders that they understood what vulnerability is, what the value is, why it's important, but they were still struggling to figure out how to apply it and how it makes sense in a business context. It's one thing to tell somebody, be vulnerable in your personal life with your spouse, your significant other. It's another thing to apply that at work, where you oftentimes have a boss, you have a hierarchy, you have deadlines, you have projects, customers, employees, and then you also have the issue of money, right? You have a salary, benefits, all that kind of stuff. So being vulnerable at work is not the same as it is when you think about being vulnerable in your personal life. And then second of all, if you're a leader, you're actually responsible for other people. You're actually responsible for the money. Being vulnerable for you is not the same as it is for everybody else. So I kept hearing these challenges from leaders and them wanting resources and ideas and guidance on how to apply it inside of their organizations. And that's when I realized this would be an interesting topic for a book. I would also hear that a lot of these CEOs were getting conflicting messages from their employees, because on the one hand, employees want their leaders to be confident and competent and visionary and strong and know that their leaders can get them out of a tough spot. But on the other hand, these CEOs were telling me that their employees also wanted them to share their failures and mistakes and struggles and, you know, personal things in their lives. And the CEOs would say, I don't understand. Which one do you want? You want the strong visionary person, or do you want somebody who's talking about their mistakes and failures? How do you make sense of that? And I thought I would start with that and try to answer those questions.
No, and I think it's excellent. I started to share with you a little bit when we were talking. I have a good friend of mine who I interviewed a few shows ago named Sean, and this subject came up. You know, he runs a church organization, and he says, yeah, it's really tough. What do you share with people? What do you share with the congregation? So and can you share your personal life? Like how do you peel that onion back? I'm going to step back just a little bit, because one of the things that you brought up is, hey, it's different if you have vulnerability at home, and it's versus vulnerability with yourself versus vulnerability in the work environment. Can I ask you, and not to get too elementary, but how do you define vulnerability, first of all?
Sure. Yeah. And that's probably a good place to start.
Yeah.
You know, Brene Brown talks about vulnerability in the sense of risk, uncertainty, and emotional exposure. And obviously she's done a lot of work in this space. I mean, we can simplify that and basically say that vulnerability is doing something or saying something that exposes you to the potential of emotional harm. And again, the risk and uncertainty is also there if you feel like you're in a risky spot or there's uncertainty in front of you that can make you feel vulnerable. But for most of us in a work setting, it's usually doing or saying something where somebody else can potentially use that as a way to hurt you. So a simple example might be you show up to work, you talk about how you're doing a project, you've never done it before. Now, all of a sudden, the spot comes up for a promotion, and one of your colleagues says, oh, don't promote Jacob. He told me he's never done that before. Why would he go into that role? I've done it before. You should promote me. And now, all of a sudden, what you said is used against you. Somebody else got promoted. You got held back. So, you know, sharing that you've never done something before could be a vulnerability for you. So that's what a lot of us think of when we think of vulnerability, specifically in kind of a work setting. It's that sharing or doing something that exposes you to the potential of emotional harm.
Okay. Well, and what about does that differ from a personal setting? How does that differ from like being a dad, for example, or being a husband, or when we really sit down, and especially like as men with ourselves, right? And we're looking in the mirror, how does that differ? Is it pretty much the same definition?
Yeah, it is very similar. I mean, there's no such thing as like a definition of work vulnerability versus personal vulnerability. The difference is in the context and the dynamic, right? I mean, you have a very different environment at home than you do at work. At home, You're with your family, you're with your kids, your spouse, your significant other. At work, you're with somebody who hired you. At work, you're with somebody where you're responsible for deadlines and projects, somebody where you owe something to somebody else, like a customer or an employee. So it's a very different dynamic, which means that we need to think about vulnerability in a different way at work.
Okay. So when you're saying think about vulnerability a different way, one of the lines, and I have some notes here. One of the lines near the beginning of your book, because I got a chance to preview your new book, Leading with Vulnerability, which I think is phenomenal. I really enjoy your writing style. I mean, genuinely, I think it's great. And so, and the way that you present what many people shared with you, you have such a manner in being able to present that and not dress them down. So it's like, hey, let me share with you what this person shared with me that's vulnerable and transparent, but without saying, pointing the finger, so to speak, if that makes sense. But I know one of the comments that you said that I thought really stood out and was pretty powerful was something along the lines of, well, you got to have a thick skin, but not armor.
Yes.
And it was something along those lines. So what do you mean by that? Because we do in leadership, often it's the wall or the thick skin, but you said that specifically, have this thick skin, but not armor. Can you expand on what you meant by that some?
There's definitely a big difference between thick skin and armor. The analogy that I like to use is thick skin is a leader who's on the football field with you. They're going to take the hits. They're going to charge ahead, and they're going to help make sure that you're able to achieve the goals. Somebody with armor isn't even willing to step onto the field to begin with. They're just avoiding the difficult conversations. They're shutting you down. They're not even willing to participate in those things. So somebody with armor is just shielded away completely. Somebody with thick skin is involved in those conversations, but they do so in a way where they are able to take the tough feedback and the criticism and oftentimes not have it be personally and negatively impacting and affecting them. So as a leader, you have to have thick skin because a lot of the decisions that you make, a lot of the things that you say or do are going to get analyzed and scrutinized and questioned. And if you don't have that level of thick skin, you're certainly going to crumble under their pressure. You're going to feel that you're just not able to deal with things. And similarly, if you're walking around with armor, you're never going to be receptive. You're never going to even hear that feedback or criticism from other people. And you're just going to keep going in the wrong direction, never knowing that you're going in the right direction because you're not going to be listening to what people are telling you.
Sure.
So thick skin is definitely an important aspect when we think about leadership and leading with vulnerability.
So that armor is sort of the old school mentality of, well, it's my way or the highway. This is where we're headed. Yep. And you're either on the bus or you're not, right?
Yeah. And it's funny because one of the CEOs, I can't remember which CEO it was, but it's a story in the book. He was telling me that when he was early on in his career, he was working for another CEO and he tried to give this CEO some sort of constructive feedback and criticism, something to the tune of, what would be really helpful is if you were able to communicate things like that. That way my team would be able to understand it and we would be able to do things the way that you want it to get done. And the CEO at the time basically looked at him and said, "What are you, my marriage counselor? I don't pay you to give me advice or feedback." Right? That's armor. I don't even want to hear what you're saying. I'm just going to shut you down and do things the way that I want. Shut up and do it, or don't work here.
Well, and I don't think those sorts of CEO, I mean, where we're at right now in society, I don't get the sense that those sorts of CEOs, those sorts of leaders in general, in any level of leadership, doesn't matter if you're at the top of leadership, somewhere in the middle, or if you're somebody that, because we've all been in situations at work where you're kind of leading from the front and people are surrounding you. But if you have that mentality that, well, I'm just going to shut it down and this is my idea, and so that's what we're doing, I don't think that plays really well in today's work environment in general.
No, it does not. It doesn't play well in today's work environment, but it still exists and it's still very rampant in today's work environment.
Sure.
So that's one of the things that I'm hoping to change with the book. And, one of the things we didn't touch on is the difference between vulnerability and leading with vulnerability. So I don't know if
I was just going to bring that up actually, because I think that's really good. What is the difference between, because me being vulnerable is one thing, me being like feeling transparent, a little bit of I'm revealing this here, right? That's just me sitting and being vulnerable. But what is the difference between the two?
I don't advocate for anybody being vulnerable at work, especially if you're in a current or leadership position. I think it can actually cause far more harm than it can help you. And the reason for that is because if you get hired to do something inside of an organization, you got to remember that you're hired because the company is essentially saying, we need help with something. We have things that we need to get done. And you as an employee or a candidate are saying, I can do those things and I can do those things well. So if you get hired in that situation and you show up to work every day and day after day, you keep showing up saying, I need help. I made a mistake. I'm sorry I did that. I'm not feeling good. I'm going through a tough time. And at some point, somebody's going to look at you and say, you know what? Something's going on here. Like, it doesn't seem like you're a good fit for this role. That's purely just being vulnerable. And so a classic difference, a classic example might be is you give me a project to do. I do the project and I screw it up. Being vulnerable would be me going to you and saying, hey, you know what? I'm really sorry I messed up this project. That's vulnerable, but it doesn't do anything for the leader. At the end of the day, the leader is still going to look at you and say, yeah, okay, that's great. Thank you for telling me you messed it up. And what? Like what? How does that help? That doesn't do anything for me. So instead, leading with vulnerability would be something like, hey, I'm really sorry. I know you gave me this project. I messed it up. But here's what I learned from the mistake that I made. And here are 3 things that I'm going to do to make sure that this mistake never happens again. That's leadership plus vulnerability. And that's the way to think about this. I call it the vulnerable leader equation. Leadership plus vulnerability equals leading with vulnerability. Leadership is competence, demonstrating that you're either good at your job or are trying to close the gap. You're trying to learn and grow and get better. And vulnerability is the connection piece. You need competence and connection. And oftentimes we forget to infuse those two things together, or we use vulnerability as a way to justify why we don't have the competence to do something to begin with. So to define what a vulnerable leader means, it's a leader who intentionally opens themselves up to the potential of emotional harm. That's vulnerability. But while taking action to create a positive outcome, that's leadership. What's the action that you're going to take? It's fine if you make a mistake. It's fine if you need help. It's fine if you're going through a tough time. All that stuff is okay. I'm not saying don't share it, but what are you doing to improve the situation? What are you doing to get better? What are you doing to learn and to grow? What are you doing to solve the problem yourself? You can't just keep saying these things and kind of offloading and expecting other people to solve your problem and expecting other people to do things for you. I have a team of people that I work with, and we all make mistakes. I make mistakes all the time. So does my team. And I always tell them when they make a mistake, I say, great, thanks for telling me. What are you going to do to make sure this doesn't happen again? Or somebody will say, Absolutely. Hey, Jacob, I need your help on this. And I say, great, I'm happy to help you. But going forward, what are you going to do to help yourself? So as a leader of a small team, I want to know what's the action? What's the leadership piece that people are taking? Because if everyone just comes to me and says, hey, Jacob, I'm so sorry I did that. Hey, Jacob, I really need your help. Hey, Jacob, I can't do that. At a certain point, as a leader of a team, I'm going to look at that and say, we need to talk. I'm not sure you're a good fit for this role.
Well, I think that's a major difference. And I love what you're saying here. That's a major difference between being a problem solver, right? A good leader that has vision and is able to solve problems. They're not just coming to the table saying this is wrong, right? That's the difference between being a problem solver and a problem spotter. I think John Maxwell stated that at one point. He says, we got an abundance of problem spotters, but who do we have that are problem solvers?
Yes.
Tammy shares this statement. She says, vulnerability as a leader is about having the courage to be yourself and not just to cover yourself. And I think that's very relevant. Mike brought this up from Leadership with Mike. He says, it doesn't work, but it's everywhere. I think that was the prior conversation when we were talking about those sort of my way or the highway commanding type of leaders. So is it, when you're talking about leading with vulnerability, it is taking the ownership. It's okay, I'm opened up to emotional harm, or what I'm hearing you say is I'm opened up to that emotional harm, but here's some solutions. Here's some direction. We're still going to head and tread down this path. And a lot of times I think it's valuable if you've already included your team in that when you're going to your next level of leadership to say, hey, I've already got buy-in and here's where we're headed.
Yeah. What's the action that you're taking? Again, I'm not saying, never use vulnerability, but when possible, don't use it on its own. Try to add the leadership piece, because the people that you work with, the people that you work for, and everybody around you are going to expect for you to demonstrate that you are also competent, because that's the environment in which we work. People are dependent upon you. You are dependent upon them. You have deadlines, you have deliverables, you're a part of a team. And if you keep demonstrating to other people that you are not competent and you're a part of a team, guess what's going to happen? Everybody's going to look at you and they're going to say, you don't belong on this team. To give an analogy that one of the CEOs I interviewed gave me, and he's Steve Built, the CEO of a company called Smile Brands. He said, if you show up to 6th grade math and you keep asking about 4th grade math, eventually the students and the teacher are going to look at you and say, you got to go back to 4th grade math. But if instead you show up and you say, hey, I know I'm a little bit behind, but I hired a tutor. I'm going to be staying after school a little bit longer to get extra help from the teacher. Instead of doing 5 homework problems every night, I'm going to be doing 10. You're demonstrating that you're trying to close the gap, that you're trying to become more competent, that you're trying to become better. That is what those around you want to see. That's what people care about. It's an important aspect that we oftentimes neglect.
They care about not just their own growth, but seeing their leader grow. Tammy says here, competency can be learned and grown. Leadership is enabling others to act and learn and creating a space to improve. And as you're talking about growth, one of the things I think that oftentimes one of the things that gets in the way of growth is quite simply it's ego. right?
Yeah.
Leaders think, well, I got put here for a reason, and so I can't do that. But you have to be. I've heard it said you got to bruise your ego, right? That's being vulnerable. You have to bruise your ego a little bit to be willing to grow and keep people in line to follow you.
Yeah.
Let me ask you another question. So we talk a lot about leading with vulnerability. Can you be too vulnerable of a leader? I mean, I think you've sort of alluded to that. But when you're saying, hey, how do you know when this person is being too vulnerable? Or how, better question, how, if you are in a leadership role, if I'm the person, I'm reading your book and or I'm listening to this podcast and I'm saying, okay, I got it, I'm going to be a vulnerable leader. What are some measuring sticks, 2 or 3 things that you might be able to look at yourself and say, well, that's probably too much and it's going to be a detriment?
There's a framework that I have in the book called the vulnerability wheel, which gives you a couple of different attributes and things that you should be paying attention to. And the way that you think about the wheel is a series of concentric circles. At the middle of this is intention. So before vulnerability comes up at all, you got to ask yourself, what is it that I'm going to be sharing and why do I want to share it? If you can't answer that question, that's an immediate, I shouldn't do it. So why are you wanting to talk about something personal? Why are you talking about this mistake? Why are you talking about whatever it is? Are you trying to become more relatable to your team? Are you trying to create an environment where there's more collaboration or innovation? Like what is the purpose behind what it is that you're trying to do? And what is it that you want to share that's going to help you get to that purpose? That's the center, intention. One ring out from that is, so again, intention, and one level out from that is what? So intention is why do you want to share it? The level out from that is what is it that you want to share? And then the third level out from that is who do you want to share with? Are you talking to people who genuinely have your best interest in mind? Or are you talking to people who want to bring you down and rip your head off? So knowing who you're talking to makes a difference. One level out from that, the fourth level is your tone. How are you getting your message across? For example, I can ask you for help. I can say, hey, I need your help with this. Can you just do this for me really quick? And that's more of like a directive than it is a genuine ask for help. Or you could say, hey, you know what? I'm really struggling with this. I'm behind. Can you please do me a favor and help me out a little bit? That's more vulnerable. That's more creating that connection. And the last rung out from that, the last circle, is professionalism. And that is behaving in a way that is respected or expected of the role that you're in. For example, if you are the leader of a team and you have an employee who's giving a presentation and it's a terrible presentation, it's not very professional for you to look at that employee in front of everybody and say, how did you get this job? You're an idiot. That's the worst presentation I've ever seen. Get out. That's not professional. So following these 5 things is crucial. So if I'm thinking of infusing vulnerability, I'm first going to ask, well, what's the purpose of doing it? What is it that I want to share? Who am I sharing with? What tone am I going to use to get this message across? And am I doing so in a professional way? And this checklist, it could either be, so I've had some CEOs really go through and actually write these things out and take a day or a few days to think through it. And I also hear stories of CEOs before they go into a meeting, it's just a quick 20-second checklist. But the way to think of this is if you get to one of these things and you either don't know the answer or you get to one of them and the answer is no, then you should probably stop. So that's, I think, a very useful tool for people to use that will keep you from going too far.
No, I think that's excellent, and far more than I expected. I think the couple of end caps too. I have, because I always take notes while I'm talking. So if I break eye contact, it's because I'm taking notes for myself because I love the opportunity to learn. But I think that's really strong. Like that first question of intention and why am I sharing this? And then you have several other layers in between, and then at the end with your tone and professionalism. The thing to look at is, here's how I feel about it, and you correct me if I'm wrong, Jacob. Like as I get closer to the outside, as I'm moving on out in those questions, I think if that first answer is no, yeah, absolutely, you stop and wrong reasons, wrong time, all of that stuff. But as you move more to the outside, it may be not that I shouldn't share this or I shouldn't be vulnerable with this, but is the timing right? Like maybe I shouldn't right now, right? Or you need to build some more framework or some more into that. Would that be a fair statement?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So, why is it, if this is something that's so powerful and it came up in CEO after CEO, like you commented in this book, you said like this kept coming up. If vulnerability in leadership is such a powerful trait, such a powerful characteristic to have, and you have a whole framework built on it, a whole book coming out on it, why is it still so hard to have a conversation around it?
Yeah, it's not always easy. So we asked 14,000 employees, and we asked them, what's the number one reason that's keeping you from being vulnerable at work? And
Okay.
the answer is actually the solution. The number one reason why people don't want to be vulnerable at work is because they don't want to be perceived as being incompetent. So the solution is to be competent. The solution is to add leadership. Obviously, if you just keep walking around saying, I don't know how to do this, I need help with this, I can't do this, I'm feeling this, you are projecting that aura of incompetence. So add that level of leadership to it. Demonstrate that you're competent or trying to close that gap. And by doing so, that will help solve the problem for you. But again, it's something that we always forget. Now, there's a little bit of a catch when it comes to vulnerability and competence. And there's a concept in psychology called the pratfall effect. And the pratfall effect basically states that if you're good at your job and you're vulnerable, so you're really good at your job and now you make a mistake. Now you're talking about failures. What happens is people will look at you and they'll say, oh, wow, Jacob's good at his job. Oh, and he's able to talk about his mistakes. Wow, he's more human. Oh, he's even a better leader than I thought. You get a bump. You get an added bump if you're good at your job and you're vulnerable. If you're not good at your job and you're vulnerable, what happens is it reinforces your mediocrity. So let's say I'm an average employee. I'm not that great. I'm kind of a C player and I keep showing up to work and I'm vulnerable all the time. What's going to happen is people will take in that vulnerability and they'll say, yeah, that makes sense. I get why Jacob's a C player. It will reinforce my level of mediocrity. This is why it's so crucial to keep infusing the competence and the leadership piece in the things that you do. It'll be the biggest thing that you can do for your career, and it'll be the best thing that you can do for everyone around you, especially if you're part of a team.
That's good. Sorry, I sometimes I put you on the screen so that you can sit and pontificate. Plus, it allows me to take notes and really listen. So let me ask you. Let me shift gears on you a little bit. Because while we're talking about wins and while we're talking about the book coming out and so forth, what do you do if someone, because you're leading with vulnerability and saying, hey, here's this thing and here's my solutions, and if you're doing all the right things or you believe you're doing all the right things, you've worked through your wheel and my intention's right, my tone's right, and my delivery's right, but somebody still decides to use that against you.
Yep.
What do you do in that situation if they say, well, I'm still going to try and spin this around and say why Jacob's not competent or he's too vulnerable or whatever? How do you approach that?
I can promise you that at some point in your life, vulnerability will be used against you. That's just kind of the nature of the game. Similarly, at some point, you're going to ask somebody out and they'll say no. At some point, you'll ask for a raise and you'll be turned down. At some point, you'll ask for a job and you will be told no. And at some point, you'll be vulnerable and it will be used against you. So that's the promise and the guarantee that I can make. But it's not going to happen nearly as often as you think. So in a lot of the studies and games that have been done around trust, they found that on average, the likelihood that you are going to trust somebody is 50-50. It's kind of the flip of a coin. Sure. But the truth is, you can actually trust people 80% of the time, meaning that you only perceive somebody to be trustworthy 50% of the time, but the truth is that they're trustworthy 80% of the time. Now, again, it doesn't mean you're never going to get burned. It doesn't mean it won't ever get used against you. But again, it's not going to happen nearly as often as you think. Well, then the question becomes, what do you do when somebody does use vulnerability against you? And there are several stories in the book of CEOs who have shared times when vulnerability was used against them. Well, at that point, you have a choice. You can either take a step back and say, well, I'm never going to be vulnerable again because it didn't go my way. Or you have a chance to take a step back and say, what did I learn about this situation, about the other person, and about myself that I can apply in future scenarios and situations? That's the ideal path that you want to take. It's kind of like, take a common example, right? You're at work, you ask for a promotion and you get told no. Are you then going to take a step back and say, well, I got told no, I'm never going to ask for another promotion again? Or if you ask
some people might.
Yeah. Or if you ask somebody out on a date and you get told no, are you going to say, I'm never going to ask anybody else out ever again? That would be a very bad way to live. And that would
Celibacy might be for them.
Yeah. I mean, but it's not a good way to live. It's not a good way to be a part of an organization, right? I mean,
sure.
What was it? Wayne Gretzky who said you're going to miss 100% of the shots that you don't take.
Yes,
so you have to take a step back, look at what you learned and apply those things to future scenarios. But like I said, it will get used against you at some point.
I think it definitely will. Do you ever, if it is used against you, because almost always one of the things I think that happens at work, especially when it comes to leadership and subordinates and people in that, oftentimes you don't hear from that person directly that what you shared is being used against you. It's like a game of telephone, right? You sort of hear it through the grapevine, and I heard this person said this. Do you ever recommend somebody that's in a leadership role just approaching that in a professional manner, but having a one-on-one conversation? Hey, I heard this was said. Let's talk about it. What's your thoughts or approach on that? I
guess it depends on the context. So you mean a leader going up to an employee and saying, I heard you said this, let's talk about it?
Yeah, that short version, yes.
I guess it depends on what the this is. So what, in your example, what would the this be?
I mean, let's say, for example, you as a leader, you lay out a plan to approach a goal. Halfway through the month, your plan has completely, the wheels come off, and you say, hey, the wheels have come off, and we're going to have to go and create a new plan. We still have the same goal. Obviously, like the business doesn't have, their goals don't change. We still have the same goal. Well, then the talking starts of like we're saying here. Let's say then one of the things I found is negativity is like cancer at work, right? It spreads. Yep. And so one person says, oh, I heard Mike said that this wasn't going to work and we're never going to make it to the end of the month, and we're halfway through and now we got to start over. And they start that sort of deal. Well, eventually it gets back to you, right? And you came at it with the approach of, hey, this failed. I'm acknowledging it failed. And here, let's try this different tact. So do you ever pursue the person that you heard that it's coming from, or do you just say, no, this is the plan and we go after it? Like in that sort of context, what would you recommend?
I'm always a big fan of clarification. In fact, one of the frameworks that I have in the book is something called the follow-up. And that is, if you say or do something that you think doesn't get received in the right way, you have the opportunity to always go and clarify. It's very different, right? I mean, if you look at sports, right, there's no clarification. Sports, you either cross the finish line or you don't. In gymnastics, right, you either perform or you don't. But when it comes to the business world, if you say or do something that you think doesn't land well, you have the opportunity to follow up and say, hey, I just wanted to make sure you got this in the right way because I've been hearing some things. And I really just want to clarify some of these points, and then let me know if you have any questions about it. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Being able to communicate and get your point across as a leader is crucial. Of course, it's not going to happen all the time. So there's nothing wrong with clarifying it, going back, saying, hey, I heard this. I think it's causing a little bit of a confusion on the team, or some people are worried about it. And I'm not upset that you're talking about it. I get it. Maybe I didn't communicate it in the best way. So let me try again. Here's what I meant. Let me know if you have any questions.
Great. No, that's fantastic. So let me shift gears a little bit too, at this point, like to you, as you writing the book and so forth. And I think one of the things that I find when I've interviewed authors is oftentimes they write about the things they know, not just coming from the CEO perspective, but things that you've put into practice. I think we learn that, and it's one thing to learn it, but if we never put it into practice, if we never take action on our own, then it's just, it's one of those, like hey, this is just an idea, right? And an idea without action, it just stays that idea. So from your experience, because you run an organization, I had it up on the screen a little bit ago, the futureorganization.com, right? And so you have people, you're in a leadership role. Besides leading yourself, you're leading others. What have you learned from interviewing these people and writing the book that is something that, like one or two things that was new to you in writing this book that you're saying, hey, I'm going to put this into practice right now?
Well, there are a few things, and I don't know if it's so much of putting into practice as much as things that I've learned that I was surprised by. So one, I was surprised that a lot of the leaders that I interviewed told me that they had very unpleasant experiences with vulnerability. I had CEOs share panic attacks that they've had. The fact
I
that
remember that, reading that in the book.
yeah, I mean, I had a panic attack when I wrote the book, which we can talk about too if you want. But CEOs I've interviewed shared that during moments of vulnerability, they've had panic attacks. They've gone through tough times. They felt uneasy and queasy, and their stomachs hurt, and it was just an unpleasant and uncomfortable feeling. And we oftentimes don't think of that when we think of leaders. So I was very surprised to hear that. And again, we don't talk about that enough. But
the
as far
commonality.
as, yeah, exactly. But as far as things to put into practice, I mean, a lot of the CEOs that I interviewed believe in and they understand the component of competence and connection. And so a big thing that I've been implementing as well in my life ever since I've discovered this and started writing the book is to do that, is to add leadership to any time I need to be vulnerable, especially with my team in a work setting. That's probably been the biggest factor here. And the other piece is the intention. I was surprised to hear how often leaders really have to think through intention, because there have been lots of stories that are chronicled in the book where CEOs share something and it inadvertently gets taken out of context, or somebody inadvertently takes what a CEO said as a command and as the new rule of law. So being very careful and intentional with the words that you use and the actions that you exhibit are, I think, for leaders, very crucial.
I think that's absolutely fantastic. Tammy here, she jumps in. So she works, Tammy's background, because I know Tammy, works in nursing in Canada at a high level. And she says here, the level of anxiety, and now she's moved into the leadership consulting space, says, causes physical issues and symptoms. The level of anxiety and imposter syndrome in the C-suite is very common, and a health issue even among ranking people. And you brought up you know, and you shared this in the book, like you really started to develop some anxiety when you were doing this. Can you expand on that a little bit? Expand on your personal journey here with anxiety and getting into the book.
This book literally gave me a panic attack. And that's because my parents came from the former USSR, the Republic of Georgia is the country. And I grew up, as much as my mom tried to emulate emotional vulnerability and openness, I grew up as a young boy watching and emulating my dad, who believes there's no such thing as a trophy for second place, who believes that nobody cares about your problems. You shouldn't be sharing your emotions with others. Don't burden other people with your struggles. And that's how I grew up, not being vulnerable, not believing in vulnerability, thinking it was all BS. And so a couple of years ago, after I signed the contract to write this book, I had a panic attack. And after talking to a couple of therapists, it became clear that what caused the panic attack was the very fact that I had committed to writing a book about vulnerability, which is something that I didn't believe in or practice or exhibit in any way, shape, or form. Now, thankfully, I haven't had a panic attack in a while, but it's interesting that confronting something that I was so against really forced my body, my brain, heart, and soul to kind of reconcile with that. And, you know, my body let me know what it thought of my decision to write this book, and it gave me a panic attack.
It's wild, because it is like, once you start talking about that thing, whatever that thing may be, that is not congruent with like your life, your soul, or who you are, it's like a record needle across a record, like, you know, no, I get that completely. And being very transparent here, I've experienced that. I never had prior, but I feel like I have an idea of when you're sharing that, because as I've been confronted with things, interestingly, further down the path in my leadership career, and I'm confronted with things that I go, man, I don't think I align with that, but I know it's the right thing. Like, I know this is the right thing for me or my team and so forth. That you start to experience some anxiety.
Yeah.
So one other thing I always enjoy having a conversation on, I think is valuable. I shouldn't say I enjoy it, but I think is valuable for people that are either listening to the podcast after or watching the video and so forth, is what are one or two things that you really struggled with? I mean, one you just shared here, maybe another one or two that you struggled with. And I was gonna make a joke and say I'm pretty sure we must be long lost brothers then, because my dad was that guy too. I though not from the USSR, but where it's like, nope, you put the shield up. But what are some things that you have struggled with in your leadership journey? One or two things that you're like, uh, whether you want to call it a failure or a preventative thing, that it's like, man, I hit this wall and here's what I learned from it. Do you have a story or two you'd like to share on that?
Well, for me, the big thing was always I avoided things that would make me vulnerable. So things like confrontation, things like firing people, things like reprimanding people, giving them hard feedback. Just in my personal life and even in my work life, those things are very vulnerable encounters and situations. So I would try to avoid anything that had the potential to put me in a vulnerable state until it got to a point where it just became unhealthy and somebody just had to be let go. So I've learned since then, and now I jump into things that make me feel vulnerable, whether it's having a difficult conversation, whether it's sharing something that's personal that I know somebody needs to hear, whether it's letting somebody go or giving somebody tough feedback that they need to hear. Now I'm doing those things much more on a regular basis. I'd say that's been my biggest failure or challenge or struggle, is to implement the things that I've been writing about, right? Leading with vulnerability. Again, since writing the book, I've become much, much better at it. It's a leadership practice that I've ingrained into the daily aspects of how I work. But prior to that, it's something that I never did. And that was a huge, huge struggle for me.
That's been a common theme also. There's many people that I've interviewed, and I think it's one, I know that's been something for me. It's been something, and like, you're not alone. For somebody who's listening to this, if you're in a leadership role or a management role, whether it's your first one or whether you're long into it, like, I think that is often a struggle of the best leaders, because we as leaders are empathetic to people. We want to see them grow. And when you have to take and cut ties on something like that, or give really hard feedback, I absolutely agree with you. And I hear you on that. I think that's something that is
Yep.
a common theme for a lot of people. So sort of last question, as we're coming out to the sort of tail end here. If somebody is new to this concept, right? They're coming in and they say, well, and it could be somebody that's just been promoted into management and they say, I want to be a really good leader. And I hear what they're talking about. And they're all like, they've got the fire burning, they're excited, but they're like, oh, well, where do I start? How do I do that without going overboard? Or if it's somebody, maybe they've been in leadership for a while, they've been in management, they're running their own company, and it might be something that they knew at some point in their career, but right now on this podcast, you need to remind them of something they may have forgotten. Where do you start when it comes to leading with vulnerability?
You build what I call a vulnerability mountain. And the vulnerability mountain is a very symbolic framework that I have in the book. And basically, the way you think about that is base camp and the peak.
Okay.
Base camp is, the beginning of climbing your mountain. The things that you could do are pretty easy, right? I mean, the beginning of the mountain in base camp is not that complicated. It's not that hard. It's not that steep. So for people who want to implement some of the concepts, identify what's your base camp. What's something that you could do tomorrow? What's something that you could do today, which is, it might make you a little uncomfortable, but you could do it if you needed to. You could do it if you wanted to. And then what's kind of that scary thing at the top of the mountain that you can't imagine doing if you had to right now? And once you identify what your base camp is and what your peak is, then what you do on a regular basis, day by day, week by week, and month by month, is you slowly start to climb that vulnerability mountain. And you'll make mistakes, you'll fall, you'll have to backtrack to go back up. But I think identifying those two points of the mountain are going to be crucial for you, because it gives you a starting point and it gives you a goal that you're trying to achieve.
That's really good. And I've never heard it referred to like that. Like, any sort of leadership. I think you could apply that to many things. Like, hey, here's my, whatever the mountain is. And I, like you, there's a lot of things. I love sports analogies. And for some reason, when I'm having conversations, I always fall into what's the top of the mountain, right? If you get to the top of the mountain. And so I think that's really good. I wrote it down. Like, it's your vulnerability mountain, what's your base camp? So that's where you start. And you said stretch yourself a little bit, right? Come out a little bit, but then what's the top of the mountain? Like, what's that goal that we're going for? And I think one of the things that I hear too, one thing that people need to be aware of is oftentimes, and again, this is one of those, you correct me if I'm wrong, Jacob, oftentimes from base camp, we look and we can easily see here, there's the top, right? I know exactly where I'm going, but we may not see the other smaller peaks and valleys that are going to show up along the way, right?
Yeah, that's exactly it. That's why it's a journey, and you're going to make mistakes and fall into things and have things used against you, but it's all a part of the journey.
Well, that's absolutely fantastic. I'll tell you, Jacob, we're kind of coming right to the tail end here. Do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share? I'm going to put up on the screen one more time. I can find it in my collection here. So, and I will tell you, for anybody that is watching or listening to this, go buy Jacob's new book. Go to Lead with Vulnerability. What is the actual date, the release date for it?
October 3rd.
October 3rd. So that's 2 weeks from now, about 2 weeks from now.
Yeah. And if people email me proof of purchase, we send out a bunch of bonuses. So people can reach out to bonus@thefutureorganization.com. And then if they send that over to me, we'll send them a couple of CEO interviews. We'll give them access to my Substack for 6 months for free. So people can reach out that way.
And that's awesome. That's phenomenal. Thank you for doing that. So again, that's bonus@thefutureorganization.com, right?
Yep.
For proof of purchase. I also have your email. So once I'm going to go buy a copy, certainly. But it's fantastic. I had the opportunity to preview it. And like I said, love the writing style, love what you share in there. Any final thoughts to take us out with today, Jacob?
Final thought is kind of what we started with. Leadership plus vulnerability equals leading with vulnerability. So whenever vulnerability is going to be present, try to sprinkle a little bit of that leadership on there, and it's going to make a tremendous impact in your leadership journey and career.
Awesome. Thank you again so much for joining me today on the Leadership Toolkit. I appreciate you. One last time, I'll tell everybody, make sure you go buy Jacob's book. I'm going to go ahead and take us out.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So thank you everybody for your time today. I know we value your time. Jacob shared so much awesome stuff on here. Hopefully you took notes. If you didn't, go back and listen to it again. Make sure you throw a thumbs up here on the podcast. Make sure that you subscribe to the channel, my channel, Mike Phillips, if you have not already. Jacob is easy to find on YouTube as well. He's got some great stuff that he shares over on his channel. If you look at Jacob Morgan, if you look him up on YouTube, he comes up and it's Jacob Morgan, and there's some leadership there at the tail end. So make sure you check that out, but go buy the book. I thank you everybody for your time today. I hope you have an absolutely fantastic rest of your day and your week. And until we speak next, come tune in next Wednesday, 12:05 Mountain, 2:05 Eastern. Till we speak next, be great.